As someone who comes from a background playing primarily competitive multiplayer games, it took me a while before I could finally get invested in real video games. Sorry, I meant single player games. Not only was it effortful to commit to an entire story, there were so many games to choose from, and I wasn't sure what to pick. However, I finally managed to eventually convert, and this video is for those who are looking to start, including some friends of mine who are too addicted to League of Legends. A bit of simple Google searching is quite a bit harder than watching a video, I understand, so I made this for you. I'm just glad you finally decided to try something new and actually experience good video games for the first time in your life. Before I continue on though, I just want to preface by saying having an opinion is a concept that exists. Therefore, I should be immune to all criticism. Nah, but seriously, I don't care if you disagree with my opinion. You can leave a dislike if you want, but it's not like people will see it. Thanks YouTube, by the way, for that terrific decision. What I do care about, however, is if you do in fact disagree, then feel free to leave a comment giving an alternative suggestion. For example, if you think Skyrim is a good game, even though you're wrong, at least say something because it can benefit other people watching this video by helping them decide what to play. Anyway, let's talk about some games. For this video game buffet, let's start off with some appetizers. We'll begin with the classic open world genre, where the main appeal is its focus on exploration, world building, and not finishing the main story. Despite me calling this as part of the appetizers, the open world genre is probably one of the most well known, as well as popular, to the extent where I call it overdone, genre in video games. Let's start off with Skyrim. Everyone knows what Skyrim is, it's iconic. We've probably all seen a playthrough about it or heard about it from someone. And as a game I definitely recommend as a starting point, because as you play more games, you'll start to realize how fucking garbage the game actually is. Okay, not actually. The game's pretty decent, but for an open world game, the areas feel dead, there isn't a variety of content in this world aside from the main quests and specific side stories, and the overall narrative is not the most impressive story. I would love to watch an entire video essay presenting why Skyrim should make me reevaluate my life decisions, but for now, play the game if you want a starting point, and for its phenomenal modding community, the game itself is no longer what people consider a masterpiece, given the games we have in the modern era. Speaking of masterpiece, let's talk about The Witcher 3, a game very few people would consider a masterpiece due to its obscurity. This game is an extremely underrated gem with no flaws, but it's too bad no one knows about the game. Jokes aside, it's probably one of the most well-known games when it comes to recommendations. If you know anything about single-player games, you're probably aware of the amount of times people call this their best game of all time. There is some merit to that. The game has a beautiful world that you can just lay back, explore at your own pace, experiencing the beautiful scenery that you'll never see from your basement. However, the main strength of Witcher 3 is its narrative, all the hours of content you get from a different side quest, most of which feel impactful and have their own significant stories, as opposed to simply feeling like fetch quests. And these types of quests are not the exceptions. There's a huge variety of different quests in each area that will consume hours of your time completing. But each one is worth it if you care about the world of Witcher. And because of this, it does make the world feel more alive, as you'll more often than not experience some kind of event in whichever area you decide to explore. However, the main issue with this is that many times, the events are always scripted and never actually feel natural, is the way I would put it at least. Oftentimes, the only random encounters you'll ever see in the wild are monsters that you can kill without much trouble, and not much other than that. When I think of an open world adventure, my own idea of a great open world game is as many random encounters as possible to make my own playthrough feel unique. And I don't mean random encounters like the tedious mechanic in Pokemon. I'm thinking of the idea of the world progressing on its own, non-story related NPCs exploring the world alongside you, rather than being stationed in one spot, and enemies being hostile to each other, which is actually a feature in Witcher 3, and I think that's great, but there needs to be more than that, especially with other human NPCs, not just in Witcher, but in general for open world games. All of this gives me incentive to actually waste time and not simply play an open world game for its quest system and only its story, but to just explore doing whatever I want. The two games mentioned above are arguably the most popular games when it comes to this genre, and you can usually buy both for a combined cost of less than $20, which is insane value. And while they obviously work for most people, I don't want to just repeat the same game spammed all across Reddit. I'm already tired of seeing Red Dead Redemption 2 recommended everywhere, including on threads of people asking for puzzle games. However, I'm not simply going to recommend the next game because it's unique. I genuinely feel that for this genre, it is one of the best experiences you can get once you get into it. And the game I recommend for this section is Kenshi. Compared to other AAA games, Kenshi is relatively unknown. But for those that ended up trying a game, most loved it. The world is genuinely alive because it progresses with or without you. Once you load into the game, everything is set in motion. Random NPCs will start moving, doing whatever they want, and most end up getting killed by random monsters in this post-apocalyptic world. The game doesn't wait for you to perform a certain task in order to progress. You're not the main character of this world. You're simply another one of its many different people, waiting for your turn to become enslaved. And because of this, you're not tied to any quest system or lockdown of any area. You have the freedom of exploring wherever you want and becoming whatever you want. The game gives you freedom and you just have to deal with the consequences. The best part about Kenshi is that every playthrough for every person will be different. There isn't a scripted story made by creators for you to follow. You are the one in control of what happens with your character's journey. Kenshi is a sandbox game above all else, and that's not for everyone, which is why I previously talked about 2 well-known open-world RPGs as options as well. But for anyone that would think they would enjoy the idea of open-world adventures, Kenshi is definitely a game you want to look into. I will now present you a unique experience from a Kenshi enjoyer, courtesy of Steam Reviews.
I started with one guy. I was then enslaved promptly. Being enslaved wasn't so bad. You get food and health benefits. Spent 1 week in game training strength, athletics, and laboring by day. Lockpick, thievery, and stealth under masters' noses by night. Tried to train assassination one night, which promptly turned into training dodge, melee attack/defense and martial arts. I ended up surrounded by many slavers and went down. Health benefits kicked in and they patched me up, put me back in the cage. Repeat process until I am literally an enslaved god. Release myself effortlessly from my cage and proceed to beat down entire force of slavers with bare hands. Release any slaves I find along the way, who assist me in beating down previously mentioned slavers. I escaped and many slaves joined my band outright, all of whom had good stats from being enslaved themselves so long. Beat down Holy Nation 30 days later with band of angry ex-slave martial artists. 10 out of 10 would be a slave again.
Thank you, Mr.
Deerglide.
On Steam? Very cool. And yes, the game might look like horse, and yes, the game might be quite clunky at times, especially with the atrocious combat. But from a non-objective and non-critical point of view, it can be part of the experience. Even with the flaws though, I feel like they can be eventually ignored, as the strengths of the game far outweigh these minor hiccups. Just keep in mind that you will die a lot to start the game, but it's all part of the learning process. Plus, the ways you die will be more often than not entertaining as opposed to suffering. I feel like people think this whole section was intended to be a joke based on my presentation, but I'm always serious and I never make jokes. As an ending to the appetizer section, remember that this is a buffet, so you have the option of picking all 3 of these options, and more. Just know that rather than trying to efficiently use your money by eating as much as possible, you're efficiently paying more money with your credit card by buying good games. I still count that as a win. But yeah, there's plenty of other options to consider, and I'm sure you've heard of many of these titles before, but Kenshi will be my main pick. If you want another game that's most similar to what I've described about Kenshi, look into the Stalker franchise. It functions the same way as Kenshi, where the main character of the game is the world, and you're just living in it. Its setting is also post-apocalyptic, however the gameplay mechanics are first-person shooter, as opposed to whatever Kenshi can be classified as. Now that we're done the open world section, let's move on to the entrees now. I've always felt that narrative-driven video games were the equivalent of main course dishes to the video game world. It's what separates games from simply a form of entertainment, to art, to good storytelling, and as a way to say, and it does feel like it's becoming a trend now to make games resemble movies as much as possible, at least in the realm of AAA games. If you look at the most sold games, aside from multiplayer shooters that no one wants to play after 1 year, the games that typically sell well are high-budget realistic narrative games that try to tell an impactful story through the medium of a game. But when I say sell well, it's a meaningless statement because more often than not, they fail to tell an actual, impactful story and instead focus more on the realism aspect as opposed to what actually makes a story good in the first place. Which is why there's often a huge amount of backlash for these types of titles. They're not really trying to teach a lesson or say something meaningful or even just be entertaining. They're a time sink and only serve as a benchmark for your systems. But this isn't a section dedicated to shitting on AAA games or explain why they are so vastly inferior to indie games. That's a whole other topic that can be made into a video. Due to all the factors mentioned above, it was quite easy for me to narrow down the options for this section, which isn't meant to sound like a positive thing. Originally, my pick for this section was going to be Omori. Well, I don't want to talk too much about Omori, not only because I already have a video dedicated to it, but also because it's a game you should go knowing as little as possible. The game is very heavy story driven, with its core theme being mental illness. The reason why Omori is so good in the first place is because it not only executes well on its theme and focuses the main story around it, but also excels by going further beyond what the premise is, by creating a journey we're following. A good story isn't relying on a specific theme or premise or world or any of that. Those factors only matter to people specifically looking for it. But for the general population, in order to judge if a story is truly good, it needs to actually present a compelling premise, understand what themes you want to portray, and not only execute it effectively, but also give players a reason to care, with good world building, character writing, etc., on top of an interesting premise. This all sounds so simple. I'm not saying it's easy to do or that I would do a better job. Far from it. This often seems to be the problem with stories that tend to be lackluster. The fact that they had a good premise, which is why they initially seemed interesting, but either backed off from it at the halfway point, or didn't do anything to stand out from the crowd, and instead stuck to its core premise and did the bare minimum to achieve its goals, something also known as being generic. So with these criteria in mind, let's officially start off this section. As stated previously, Omori will not be the main focus for this section, and that's not because the story isn't good enough. Quite the opposite. But I don't believe it to be the best entry point for someone trying to get into narrative games. However, if you do find yourself invested in this genre, do eventually look into Omori. You won't regret it. Here's my pick for one narrative game you should play. There are a variety of options, and I'll present them all here so you can look into those further. But one has always stood out to me, and that game is Nier Automata. There's very little that Nier Automata doesn't do right. The game is of the hack and slash genre, but at times also becomes a bullet hell, then a side-scroller, then Galaxian. And despite being very different genres, while also seeming out of place in a game intended to be mainly hack and slash, they somehow end up working well. They don't necessarily excel in their field relative to games specializing in their own type, but they do a good enough job at incorporating all these types of genres into one, and making each one feel both natural as well as enjoyable. This game can also be described as an open world game. Yet the world is not necessarily the largest when it comes to content, nor does it feel truly alive compared to maybe something else like Kenshi. But yet, it doesn't even feel like it's a flaw in its design, because in a weird way, it seems to be intended to feel dead and empty to fit its own themes and the premise of the story. The world is abandoned and the inhabitants are only machines, or occasionally, a rare moose might appear, but nothing more. And the art direction and soundtrack. I feel like trying to even explain it in words would be a waste of time because at the end of the day, it's a subjective matter. The only argument for this section would be to present it to you directly so you can judge for yourself. But if you think it's bad, your opinion's wrong. Yet, with all the strengths mentioned above, it doesn't feel like I'm implying the individual pieces of the game each excel over its counterparts for what it's trying to do. And you would initially be right. By far the greatest strength of Nier Automata is its narrative. As I've heard one of my friends say, Nier is the embodiment of philosophical concepts put into a video game. The game truly makes you ask questions to yourself at a deeper level, and rather than hold your hand and deliver its message to your face, instead presents it as if it was an interesting lecture, allows you to come to your own conclusions regarding the themes the game executes on. The greatest thing in storytelling is, in my opinion, when a message is never forced onto you, but instead allows you to figure it out on your own, and at the very least, come to an understanding as to what cryptic puzzle you decide to engage with. That is the mark of genuine good storytelling, and as a type of story you won't forget about for the rest of your pathetic life. As a final note to this section, I just want to say that at the end of the day, Narrative-driven games are still games, and somehow people often forget that. While I think some of the best narrative-driven games are either comparable or greater than other stories in other mediums, you don't achieve that by trying to replicate their system in a game. The reason a story is told through a game in the first place should be because the developers are trying to utilize what makes playing a game unique, which is the idea that players have a choice and impact on how a story is told. And if not, make the story as engaging as possible. Because isn't that the mainstream of video games? The fact that you actually feel like you're part of the story? I don't know, maybe I should go touch some grass. Desserts. Who doesn't love desserts? It's a perfect endpoint to a satisfying buffet. A light option, but still nonetheless a very tasty one. If you're an individual who just wants to chill and relax whenever they play video games, or simply have a side game they can bool on whenever they please, whether that's something you can open at any time of the day and still enjoy its content, or you're waiting in queue for a match and you want to play something on your second monitor, or when you're completely burnt out of heavy narrative-driven games, this is a section for you. Stardew Valley is commonly recommended as a casual, relaxing game for any person, whether they enjoy playing games or not. It's essentially a cute game that incentivizes the player to create their own farm, harvest crops, interact with the many people in a small town, and just have a good time to see some progression. Stardew is a fantastic game. However, I truly believe that due to the fact that there is a time limit to everything, including your daily task, the fact that you're incentivized to maximize profit in order to optimize your opportunities in the game, the idea that these fictional assholes have an expectation for you to complete everything for them, at the end of it all, you are being evaluated by your deceased grandfather. I feel like it's too much to ask for me. So instead, I'm going to recommend roguelike games. Yes, I'm serious. The whole concept of roguelite or roguelike games, I really don't care about its differences, I'll just say roguelites, is the idea that it's stressful to many people because it can be quite punishing at times. Any death usually results in a loss of progress, and obviously doesn't feel good. However, if you look past all that, you'll see that roguelike games are in fact a perfect time waster when it comes to playing games periodically. You can start a run in any roguelite, spending a few minutes to an hour successfully winning or foolishly failing, and regardless of the outcome, you can still have a good time. Put the game down, pick it back up within a few minutes or a few years, it really doesn't matter. Most roguelites are built entirely on gameplay, so you're almost always guaranteed to have a decent time. And once you drop the idea that you absolutely need to win every time, you'll slowly start to enjoy the experience more. There's no fear of losing track and trying to catch up regarding where you last left off, because there's usually no good story that you have to try and remember. Muscle memory can be easily recalled within minutes, so the only worry is whether or not you forgot about an important meeting that you needed to attend to. No worries, just tell them your fish ate your router. There's a gargantuan roster of good roguelike games, and while I've already made a video regarding one, I personally believe that this is the best entry point to the roguelite genre, while also excelling at everything it wants to do. And it's a bit of an odd choice considering the fact that I literally said prior to this that story doesn't matter for roguelites, but Hades is my pick for the best dessert type game. Hades is not only a roguelite with excellent gameplay, with an incredibly diverse roster of playstyles and builds every run, but also surprisingly has a good story on top of it all. And despite the fact that I mentioned you don't have to worry about a story in a roguelite, the existence of a good one still shouldn't incentivize you to care about it. The character writing and plot is great. If you want to jump straight into the gameplay and relax, there's nothing wrong with that. It exists as a way for the players to care about its world, but shouldn't detract you away from the gameplay. And for anyone still reluctant on the idea of roguelites, I believe Hades has a fairly easy barrier of entry while also providing a great challenge in the endgame for any player who desires more. Whether or not the game will actually be easy for you is not my problem. I personally found its base difficulty to be good enough for whenever I wanted to multitask, so your mileage may vary. Just note that at the very least, when you do die, it will at least come with funny dialogues from in-game characters mocking you. Well, that concludes the dessert section. If you are finished with a buffet, please pay your bill with cash only and... Wait, what's that? Is that a Dark Souls reference? Am I really gonna recommend Dark Souls to mostly inexperienced players?
Yes, I am!
I already know some people are gonna pause right here and comment something stupid before finishing, so if that's you, expect an equally dumb response. If you pause before this message to write it, even better. Welcome to my overall best pick for what game, or games in this case, you should consider. Meals usually end on a dessert, but this is a buffet. No one is stopping you from going for more. The Dark Souls franchise, which I'm including alongside Sekiro and Bloodborne, have notoriously been known as very difficult games. And I'm not going to say there's some truth to it, because it is 100% true. However, I'm not saying that as a way to discourage you or to hype it up for any masochists. I'm simply telling you as it is. You are going to struggle playing these games. You will at some point become frustrated, but these games are challenging, they're not hard. And the distinction is that any person can eventually beat this game with enough effort and time. The difficulty aspect comes from the games being punishing, not as a way to prevent you from progressing. Still, regardless, why am I recommending these games, especially to the intended audience of this video, which are going to be people who are inexperienced with games similar to these ones? Well, because almost no game can match the same level of world building and atmosphere as the Souls series. From the moment you step foot into whatever world you choose, you already feel what type of emotions the game is trying to stimulate. And once you swing that blade on an undead, or roll out of a heavy attack, or sidestep the swing of a beast, or parry the blades of another swordsman, you'll never forget that initial feeling of a dopamine kick. Okay, it's not that serious. The gameplay, especially in the later series, is phenomenal, but not groundbreaking. Yet despite not being the most unique, there's still some odd satisfaction that you almost never see from other games. And even though the story is never explicitly told to you, there's so much rich lore in these games, with so much detail. So much detail that you never truly understand any of it unless you watch lore summaries on YouTube if you're lazy like me. But why go through so much effort to intentionally make the story obscure and difficult to discover for the average casual player? What's the point? Well, if it wasn't obvious already, this franchise doesn't like to hold your hand. At all. If you want something, you have to work for it. Whether that's simply discovering parts of the story, or of overcoming the high difficulty of the game. The games are not impossible, not even close. In fact, I believe any individual 1.5 hands can eventually beat the game. It only takes time and some effort, both of which everyone possesses, some to a lesser degree than others. But the most important point is that these games teach patience, and teach you how to overcome obstacles. It's an important skill for whatever profession you're in, for anything in life, and most importantly, a transferable skill for whatever video game you decide to waste your time in. As a final note to everything, if you're aware about any of these games aside from Nier, all of them are quite challenging and definitely can be very punishing to any inexperienced player that's new to the genre, especially new to single-player games in general. They lack any sense of direct direction and require you, the player, to figure everything out for themselves through deduction skills and exploring the world. The tutorials, specifically for Kenshi and Dark Souls, give you the bare minimum, telling you the key bindings and what to press, but everything else becomes your problem. There is no hand-holding in those games at all, so expect to eventually use a guide or dedicate a good amount of time learning on your own. This final disclaimer is here because I know not everyone wants to struggle at a task during their pastime. While the reward could be greater than the hardship, there is no guarantee of that. Some people just want to chill playing Animal Crossing and not face any setbacks. However, I decided to still recommend them because regardless how great I think Kenshi and Dark Souls are, regardless how difficult and daunting they could be at the start, the lessons and transferable skills of these games is worth taking a risk, even if there quite literally is no risk. You can always refund the game if you truly believe it's too much. Yes, these games are obviously quite punishing, and yes, they can be frustrating. But in the end, if you manage to overcome it, the experience and reward is far, far greater than the anger and hair loss along the way. You are taught how to be patient, something many people lack nowadays. You are taught the habit of exploring. You are taught how to actually use your brain to figure out where to go, or alternatively, you are taught how to efficiently look up guides on the internet. But all these skills alongside the game's strengths themselves is why I recommend these games over any other. Yes, certain games have similar features or also indirectly teach you these skills as well, but they're never executed as well as these games, nor are they all packaged into just one singular game, like Dark Souls is. Psh, you think Skyrim's exploration is comparable to any of the games mentioned? Don't make me laugh. Jokes aside, if none of those factors were personally true for you, then that's okay, it just wasn't a game for you. Not everything's applicable to every person, but at the very least, I hope you gave it a fair shot. As a final note, the difficulty of these games are vastly overblown and exaggerated to the point where some people, including those I know, genuinely think these games are impossible to complete for inexperienced players, or that they'll struggle drastically more than inexperienced players. In reality, these types of games can be completed by literally any person that possesses at least one hand. The only advantage that people have is the fact that they'll recognize similar game mechanics if they exist, but that's it. There's nothing wrong with losing interest or giving up. That simply shows that you didn't find the effort worth it, but doesn't mean you were ever incapable of finishing the game. As a final small anecdote, I have a friend who lives in Britain, already self-explanatory, but he's probably the worst player I've ever seen, and lacks several brain cells. But he managed to beat Dark Souls 3 and Sekiro, as well as Slay the Spire, which is probably harder than both of them. So from my perspective, if he can do something, I think literally every human, and even some monkeys, could do it as well. In the end though, even if I do believe many of the games I mentioned previously are excellent in their own right, that if this video ever receives even a bit of attention, then a new group of people will start struggling in Dark Souls and potentially reignite the easy mode debate from years ago. That shit's hilarious. Also, if you want a guide on how to critically analyze games for yourself and discover the value of critical thought and the meaning of life, refer to my Should I Buy This Game guide here. I'm pointing at the top right corner.